few months ago, I posted an Instagram story to see how well my followers understand about mental health. This is what I posted. I asked them, why do you think some people are clinically depressed? Option A, they have a gene that predisposes them to depression, or a gene for depression. Option B, there are environmental factors that directly cause the development of depression. Option C, some people are just lazy. They don't want to change or get out from their comfort zone. Option D, environmental factors that work through gene expression modification, or known as epigenetic mechanism. Or option E, all of the above. I did the item analysis and I found out that 18.5% of them answered option A, and then 14.4% answered the option B, and then 9.4% answered the option C, 23.3% answered the option D, and 34.2% answered all of the above. And note that some of them actually answered more than one option, so some of them answered A and C, or probably like A and D. Okay, before we actually discuss this question, let's take a step back. Let's talk about mental illness in general. There are at least 3 points that I want to present today. Firstly, what causes mental disorders? Is it due to environment, genetics, or is it just in your head, or you don't have enough faith? Over the past few decades, people believe that both environment and genes act in part through altering gene readout in the central nervous system like brain, spinal cord, to achieve their effect on behavior. Something like this. So, say depression. Using this model, we could then say that depression can either be caused by environment, for example like stressor, loss, grief, or genetic by themselves. Is it true though? Apparently, most scholars nowadays believe that this model is biologically implausible. This model is mechanistically oversimplified. So instead, most current scholars believe in what we call as diathesis stress model. This model posits that a person must have a predisposition to a disorder and then be subjected to immediate psychosocial stress in order for them to develop a disorder. One of the most popular studies was the study of the conduct disorder. Conduct disorder, or CDD, is a repetitive and persistent pattern of behavior in which the basic rights of other major age-appropriate societal norms or rules are violated. This disorder then can develop into antisocial personality disorder, or an ASPD, after the age of 15. Also known as psychopathy, sociopathy, and social personality disorder. Symptoms include aggression to people or animal, and then destruction of properties, and then deceitful or theft, or even serious violation of the rules. This disorder had generally been thought to be caused by childhood trauma or stressor, or abuse, or poor parenting, or maltreatment, or actually anything, you name it, any environmental factors. However, current studies have actually shown that there's actual interaction between environment and genes, even for disorder like conduct disorder. One of the genes related to the development of CD they discovered was MAOA gene, or monoamine oxidase A gene, or DNA, in our X chromosome actually. And this gene encodes for monoamine oxidase A enzyme in our body. So what are those enzymes? Let's take a step back. One of the ways our bodies communicate is through chemical messengers, and they transmit messages from our nervous system. These chemical messengers are also known as neurotransmitters. One of the examples of the class of the neurotransmitters is monoamines, which include catecholamines and serotonin. catecholamine include dopamine, norepinephrine or noradrenaline, and epinephrine or adrenaline. And these neurotransmitters actually play a very important role in our mental health. For example, dopamine system has always been thought to play an important role in our motivation and wanting behavior. So this regulation of this neurotransmitter, either too much or too little, can lead to disorders such as schizophrenia or depression, so on and so forth. So, in order to keep the homeostasis or a stable equilibrium in our bodies, we have to have physiological processes that regulate the level of these neurotransmitters in our nervous system. And one of the mechanisms is by metabolizing or degrading these monoamines when we have high level of it to keep the level steady in our body. One of the ways our body degrades this monoamine is by using the MAOA enzyme. In this study, the researchers actually studied the length of the promoter region of the MAOA gene and maltreatment in children, and they want to see if there is any interaction between those two variables. The promoter region actually is the region in DNA where the transcription begins. In general, they observed that there were two types of MAOA genes. Some people have the longer MAOA gene promoter, while some people have the shorter MAOA gene promoter. And long form is associated with high MAOA activity, while the short form is linked to the low MAOA activity. And surprisingly, they found that there was an interactive effect between the MAOA activity and maltreatment in children. In other words, children that were known to be severely maltreated and carried short form of MAOA promoter were more likely to be diagnosed with conduct disorder and convicted for violent offenses as an adult. So, in other words, the phenotype or conduct disorder in this case is not due to either genetic by itself or environment by itself. It's due to both the interaction between the genes and also the environment where the child grew in. So they are not dissociable. Either severe maltreatment by itself or genetic by itself is not likely to be associated with the development of conduct disorder. In the field, this is also known as GXE or genetics X environment interaction. This model holds true for most mental disorders, including anxiety, depression, and even PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder, which I will talk more in the future videos. Okay, that being said, we can rule out B and E. Environmental factors such as loss, grief, high distress by themselves are unlikely to directly cause depression. People need some sort of biological predisposition as well to develop depression. Okay, secondly, in medicine, there's a common hypothesis called common disease, common variant, or CDCD hypothesis. This hypothesis proposes that the most common disorders is due to a relatively large number of disease-causing alleles or genes that occur relatively often in the population. To give you an example, let's talk about late-onset Alzheimer's disease. One of the hypotheses is that Alzheimer's disease is known to be associated with the apolipoprotein gene or ApoE gene. This gene encodes for apolipoprotein, which is a protein known to be involved in lipid metabolism in our bodies. And there are 4 alleles or variants of ApoE gene that can be found in human, which is apoepsilon-2, apoepsilon-3, apoepsilon-4, and apoepsilon-1. However, apoepsilon-1 is extremely rare, so it's not well studied in our current literature. And apoepsilon-3 is the most common form of the allele in human, while ApoE4 or epsilon-4 is known to be one of the major risk factors for Alzheimer's disease. In the study, the researchers actually compared the combination of the epsilon genotypes in people with and without Alzheimer's disease. They compare it relative to epsilon-3 homozygous genes, which is the most common form of allele in humans. And this is what they found. People with Alzheimer's disease are much more likely to be associated to have epsilon-4 in their genes. For instance, people with Alzheimer's disease have 14.9 chance more likely to have epsilon-4 homozygous gene compared to people with epsilon-3 homozygous genes. So if you see from the result here, people with Alzheimer's disease always have higher odds ratio if they have epsilon-4 gene in their genes. So that's CDCV hypothesis, common disease, common variant hypothesis. However, most psychiatric disorders deviate from this CDCV hypothesis, actually including Alzheimer's disease. This is only one of the examples. And instead, most psychiatric disorders fit what we call as polygenic mode of inheritance, meaning it's controlled by many genes. So just to give you a really rough picture so you know how complicated it can be, let's take an example from bipolar disorder or BD. So for example, people with VNTR or variable number of tandem repeats of their third axon and DRD4 locus in their gene, or gene encoding for dopamine D4 receptor, are more likely to develop bipolar disorder. Or single nucleotide polymorphism in their AMK3 gene encoding for enchirinon G protein, and then CAC NA1C gene, alpha-1C subunit of the L-type voltage-gated calcium channel, or SNP in the AS3NT gene, or even SNP in the ITIH3 gene. There are a lot of genes that have been studied that are known to be associated with the development of bipolar disorder. So most psychiatric disorders are caused by more than one gene, a lot of genes. So, and just to give you a big picture about what SNP is, or single nucleotide polymorphism, is like when we compare the sequence of multiple human genomes, we find that two individuals will divert in roughly one nucleotide pair in 1,000 nucleotide pairs. So when two sequence variants coexist in the population and both are common, by definition more than 1%, the variants are called polymorphism. And the majority of polymorphisms are due to the substitution of only a single nucleotide. And this is what we call as single nucleotide polymorphism. So that being said, at the current rate, we are still unable to pinpoint, say, a single gene for depression, a single gene for bipolar disorder, and most psychiatric disorders are polygenic. So therefore, we can rule out option A. And finally, some people are just lazy, option C. They don't want to change and get out of their comfort zone. Well, in the field, it is true that we often see people who display intentional production of false or grossly exaggerated physical or even psychological symptoms, usually motivated by external incentives such as avoiding military duty, avoiding work or school, obtaining financial compensation, evading criminal prosecution, or even to obtain drugs. However, by definition, this is actually called malingering. And malingering is actually not a mental disorder, while depression or bipolar disorders or conduct disorders are actually real mental disorders. Just like diabetes or chronic heart disease, they are real diseases. So as mental disorder, it is real disorders. It is not malingering. If they display the symptoms of, for example, depressive-like symptoms because they're lazy, they don't want to change, and they don't want to get out of their comfort zone, by definition, they are not clinically depressed. They are malingering. So in the field, we can usually tell if someone is malingering. There are at least 4 that are listed by DSM-5 factors that we should strongly suspect if someone is malingering. So the first one is the medical legal context of presentation. So for example, if someone is referred by an attorney to the clinician for examination, or the individual self-refer while litigation or criminal charges are pending, we have to examine them thoroughly. Probably they could be malingering. We can also suspect if someone is malingering if we see a marked discrepancy between the individual's claim, stress, or disability and the objective findings and observations. And we can also suspect someone is malingering if there is lack of cooperation during the diagnostic evaluation and in complying with the prescribed treatment of regimen. And the last one, we can also suspect if someone is malingering if there is the presence of ASPD, or antisocial personality disorder. So in the field, one of the most common practices of malingering we see is faking bad or fake bad. For instance, one of the standardized psychometric tests of adult personality and psychopathology we often use is MMPI-2, or Minnesota Multifaceted Personality Inventory. We can generally assess the validity, including whether or not they are faking bad or even faking good. So in this example, the line with triangles is the standard scores, and the line with the black dots are the real psychiatric patients, which are elevated compared to the standard scores. However, in fake bad patients, which is marked by the line with the white dots, we can see here that the scores are even much more elevated than the real psychiatric patients. You can see, especially in number 6 and number 8, the scores are more than or higher than 100. The only clinical scale that was not elevated in this patient was number 5, which is masculinity. So therefore, people who are faking bad are not the same as people who are actually clinically depressed or have any mental disorders. So that being said, we can rule out option C, and therefore the correct answer is D. So let me know how or what you think about this video. Put in your comments below, and if you like this video, please like, share, and subscribe to this channel. You can also follow my Instagram here. So thank you, and see you in the next videos. Bye.